The workshop smelled of metal and something sweeter. Something wrong. February 1949, and the grey light of a Crawley afternoon filtered through dusty windows into a space where no one should have been. The man in the neat suit stood before a 40-gallon drum, watching the surface ripple. Steam rose in thin wisps. The liquid inside hissed softly, a patient sound like rain on leaves or fat rendering in a pan. He had poured the acid carefully, precisely, the way a chemist might measure reagents, the way a watchmaker might oil delicate gears. Sulfuric acid, concentrated, industrial strength, the kind that could strip paint from steel, that could eat through bone. He had done this before, 5 times before, though no one knew it yet. The drum sat in a corner of the small engineering workshop, unremarkable among the tools and the oil-stained floor and the clutter of a working man's trade. Outside, England was rebuilding. The war had ended only 4 years past. Rationing still governed daily life. People disappeared sometimes in the chaos of reconstruction, in the movement between bombed-out streets and new beginnings. The acid continued its work, and the man waited, patient as stone, for the evidence to vanish into liquid nothing. Chapter 1. The Chapel and the Choir Boy. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world beyond your window has grown quiet and small. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether in the stillness of your room or in the last hours before dawn, you have found your way here to this small corner of the past. What time is it where you are? Perhaps the clock has already turned towards tomorrow, or perhaps you're listening as the day fades into evening. It matters little. Time moves differently here, in these stories drawn from the shadows of history. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so now. Each week we journey together into the darker corners of the past, into the stories that linger in old courtrooms and forgotten workshops, in the memories of those who witnessed what others tried to erase. Your subscription helps this channel grow, helps these stories find those who seek them in the quiet hours, and if you find value in tonight's tale, if it carries you gently towards sleep while teaching you something of the world that was, please consider sharing it with others who might listen in the darkness as you do now. These stories matter. They are the record of what we were, of what we are capable of becoming. Tonight we travel to England, to the years between the wars, to a small boy growing up in the shadow of chapel walls, and the particular kind of religion that leaves marks deeper than any sermon. Let us drift backward now, to Yorkshire, to the 1920s, where a child learned lessons that would shape him in ways no one could have predicted. Wakefield stood in the West Riding of Yorkshire, a town built on coal and cloth, where mill chimneys rose like blackened fingers against perpetual grey skies. The streets ran with the rhythm of industry, with the clatter of looms and the deep underground rumble of men working seams of coal that had been there since before history had a name. It was a working town, a practical place, where chapel attendance on Sunday balanced the grime of the working week, and families kept themselves to themselves in terraced houses that all looked the same. John George Haigh was born there on July 24th, 1909, in one of those terraced houses, to John Robert Haigh and Emily Haigh. The father worked as an engineer, a skilled man with steady hands and a steady wage. The mother kept the house with the fierce devotion of those who had grown up with less and were determined that their children would know better. They were not wealthy, but they were respectable, and in the England of that time, respectability mattered more than comfort. But the Hayes were different from their neighbours in one essential way. They belonged to the Plymouth Brethren, a Protestant sect that had split from the Church of England nearly a century before, that held to a strict and literal interpretation of Scripture that separated itself from the worldliness that surrounded it. The Brethren did not believe in priests or formal church hierarchy. They gathered in simple meeting halls, sang hymns without musical accompaniment, broke bread in remembrance of Christ's sacrifice, and waited for the second coming with the patient certainty of those who knew they had been chosen for salvation. For a child growing up in such a household, the world divided itself neatly into the saved and the damned. There were no gradations, no compromises. The brethren did not attend theatres or cinemas. They did not dance. They did not associate with those outside their fellowship, except when necessity demanded it. They read their Bibles daily, prayed before every meal, and understood that the flesh was weak and the devil walked abroad seeking whom he might devour. Emily Haigh believed this with the intensity of the truly converted. She had come to the brethren as a young woman, and had found in their fellowship a certainty that the broader church could not provide. Her faith was not gentle. It was a thing of rules and boundaries, of constant vigilance against sin, of the understanding that evil crouched always at the door, and only the most rigorous discipline could keep it at bay. She loved her son, but she loved God more, and she was determined that the boy would be raised in the fear of the Lord. The house on Outwood reflected this devotion. There were no pictures on the walls, for images might lead to idolatry. There were no novels, no newspapers beyond those that reported facts without opinion. No radio playing music that might stir unseemly feelings. The Bible sat on the table in the front room, opened each evening for family devotions, its pages worn soft from constant handling. John Robert read aloud in his steady voice, while Emily listened with her hands folded in her lap, and young John sat between them, learning the cadences of King James English, the poetry of judgment and mercy and blood sacrifice. The boy was clever. Everyone agreed on that. He learned to read early, absorbing the Bible stories with the same facility he showed for his schoolwork. He sang in the chapel choir, his voice clear and true, rising with the other voices in hymns that spoke of salvation purchased at terrible cost, of lambs led to slaughter, of blood that washed white as snow. He was well-mannered, polite to his elders, obedient in the way of children who have learned that obedience is the only safe path through a world full of traps. But Emily worried. She watched her son with the eyes of one who knew how easily a child could stray, how the world waited to corrupt and destroy. She built around him what she called a wall of protection, though others might have called it something else. She marked a line around the house, a physical boundary drawn in chalk or paint, and told the boy that within this line was holy ground, that the space inside belonged to God, and nothing evil could cross it. The devil lived outside, she said, in the streets where other children played, in the places where sin flourished unchecked. Young John learned to stay within the line. He played alone in the small yard behind the house, inventing games that required no companions, building worlds inside his own head where he was safe from both the devil and his mother's watchful gaze. He was not allowed to play with the children from the neighbouring houses, for they were not of the brethren, and association with them might lead him into temptation. He walked to school and home again, spoke to his teachers with perfect courtesy, and sat by himself during the lunch hour, eating the sandwiches his mother had prepared, while other boys kicked balls and shouted in the yard. It was a lonely childhood, but he did not know enough to call it that. Loneliness requires comparison, and he had nothing to compare it to. This was simply the world as it existed, the way things were meant to be. Inside the line was safety, outside was danger. Inside was mother and father and chapel, and the certain knowledge that God watched everything. Outside was everything else, vast and unknown and forbidden. The chapel itself stood on a side street not far from their home, a plain building of yellow brick with tall windows of clear glass, for stained glass was too much like Catholic ornament. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and bare. Wooden benches served for pews. A simple table at the front held the bread and wine for communion, covered with a white cloth that Emily Haigh washed and ironed every Saturday evening. The congregation numbered perhaps 50 souls, working people mostly, shopkeepers and clerks and skilled labourers who had found in the brethren's certainty something that the broader world could not provide. They gathered 3 times on Sunday and twice during the week for Bible study and prayer. The meetings lasted hours, with hymns and testimonies and long passages of scripture read aloud and discussed verse by verse. Young John sat through these gatherings with perfect stillness, his hands folded in his lap, his face composed in an expression of attentive piety. He learned which verses brought nods of approval from the elders, which topics stirred the most fervent amends. He learned to speak the language of faith with the same facility he showed for arithmetic and grammar. But something was happening inside him that no one could see. Behind the obedient eyes and the choir boy voice, a division was forming, a split between the boy who sat in chapel and sang of grace and the other boy, the one who lived in the privacy of his own thoughts. That boy watched and calculated. That boy noticed how power worked in the small world of the brethren, how certain men commanded respect through the force of their conviction, how certain sins were forgiven while others were not, how appearance mattered more than substance as long as the appearance was maintained. He was 9 years old when he first stole something. It was a small thing, a pencil from a desk at school, nothing of value. But he took it, and he was not caught, and the world did not end. God did not strike him down. The devil did not claim him. He had crossed a line that Mother had said could not be crossed, and nothing happened. It was a small revelation, but revelations do not need to be large to change the shape of a life. He began to experiment. Small thefts, small lies, small violations of the rules that governed his existence. He was careful, clever, never taking enough to be noticed, never lying about things that could be easily checked. He learned the pleasure of deception, the private satisfaction of having a secret self that no one suspected. At chapel he was still the good boy, the one who sang so beautifully, who knew his scripture verses, who sat quietly while the elders droned on about righteousness and judgment. At home he was still obedient, still careful to stay within the line his mother had drawn. But inside, in the country of his own thoughts, he was already somewhere else. The school he attended was Wakefield Grammar School, a good institution that prepared boys for respectable professions. He excelled there, particularly in mathematics and science, subjects that required logic rather than imagination. His teachers praised his diligence, his neat handwriting, his ability to solve problems that stymied other students. He won prizes for academic achievement. His parents attended the ceremonies where these prizes were awarded, his mother in her best dress and his father in the suit he wore for chapel, and they sat in the audience with quiet pride, believing that their devotion was being rewarded, that the boy was growing into the man God intended him to become. But the boy who accepted those prizes had already learned to see himself as separate from the rules that bound other people. He had learned that appearances could be manufactured, that trust could be exploited, that the world was not actually divided into the saved and the damned, but rather into those who were clever enough to take what they wanted and those who were foolish enough to believe what they were told. It was not a conscious philosophy, not yet. It was more like a seed planted in dark soil, waiting for the right conditions to send up its first shoots into the light. The 1920s passed into the 1930s. John George Haigh grew from a boy into a young man, tall and slender with dark hair that he kept carefully combed, with hands that were always clean and a smile that came easily to his lips. He left school at 17 with good marks and better recommendations. He found work as an apprentice to a motor engineer, learning the trade his father practiced, learning to understand how machines worked, how metal could be shaped and joined, how precision in small things led to functioning wholes. The work suited him. It required attention to detail, patience, the ability to see how parts fit together. He was good at it. His employers praised him. But even as he worked with his hands, as he learned to repair engines and fabricate parts, his mind was working on other problems, other possibilities. He had begun to understand that the world beyond Wakefield was larger than anything the brethren had taught him, that there were ways to live that had nothing to do with chapel meetings and Bible verses, and mothers who drew lines to keep the devil out. He was 24 years old when he left Yorkshire for London. He told his parents he was seeking better opportunities, that a young man with his skills could find proper work in the capital, work that paid better than anything Wakefield could offer. They believed him because he had always given them reason to believe him, because the face he showed them was the face of a dutiful son who honoured his father and mother as Scripture commanded. London in 1933 sprawled vast and indifferent under perpetual coal smoke, a city of 8 million souls where a young man from Yorkshire could vanish into the crowds and become whoever he claimed to be. John George Haigh stepped off the train at King's Cross with a single suitcase and a head full of plans that had nothing to do with honest employment. The chapel boy was gone, or rather, the chapel boy had become a useful disguise, a costume to be worn when circumstances required it. The real work was about to begin, the work of becoming someone else entirely, the work that would lead, through fraud and forgery and eventually through acts that no one in Wakefield could have imagined, to a workshop in Crawley where acid drums waited and human beings dissolved into sludge. But that was years away still. For now he was simply a young man in London, clean and polite and eager, looking for his chance. Chapter 2. The Forger's Apprenticeship. London absorbed newcomers the way the Thames absorbed rain, without comment or ceremony. The city in 1933 existed in layers, in strata of class and opportunity that a careful observer could learn to navigate. At the top were the old families in their Mayfair houses, the bankers and barristers whose ancestors had held the same positions for generations. Below them spread the middle ranks, the shopkeepers and clerks and commercial travellers who kept the machinery of commerce turning. And below that, in lodging houses and basement flats and rooms rented by the week, lived those who were making their way up or sliding their way down, the ambitious and the desperate existing side by side in the great anonymous mass of the city. John George Haigh found rooms in a boarding house in Earl's Court, a district west of the centre, where respectability frayed at the edges, and landladies asked few questions as long as the rent appeared on time. The house stood in a terrace of identical structures, 4 stories of begrimed brick with windows that looked out onto a street where trams clanged past at regular intervals. His room was on the 3rd floor, furnished with a narrow bed, a wardrobe that smelled of camphor, a chair, and a small table beneath the window. He shared a bathroom with 5 other lodgers and took his meals in the dining room downstairs, where a gas fire hissed in the grate, and the landlady served weak tea and bread with margarine that tasted faintly of fish oil. It was not what he'd imagined when he'd pictured himself in London, but it would serve. Everything would serve until something better came along. He had arrived in the capital with £20 in savings, enough for a few weeks of careful living, and with the certainty that his intelligence and his presentable appearance would open doors that remained closed to rougher men. He was right, but the doors that opened led to places he had not anticipated. He found work first in a motor showroom in Kensington, a respectable establishment that sold new automobiles to those who could afford such luxuries even in the depths of the Depression. His job was to keep the cars polished, to greet customers when they entered, to fetch the salesman when someone showed serious interest. The work was menial, but the surroundings were elegant, and he learned by watching and listening how the business of selling was conducted, how desire could be manufactured through suggestion, how a man's vanity could be converted into a signature on a contract. He noticed how the salesmen dressed, the quality of their suits, the way they knotted their ties, the polish on their shoes. He noticed how they spoke, the casual mention of other customers, the implication that ownership of such a vehicle would place one among a certain class of people. He noticed that what was being sold was not transportation but identity, not the machine but the image of one's self as someone who could afford such a machine. It was theatre, all of it, a performance designed to separate money from those who had it. He began to dress better, spending money he could not spare on a suit from a pawn shop, on shirts with stiff collars, on shoes he polished every evening until they gleamed. The transformation was gradual but deliberate. Within 6 months, he no longer looked like a mechanic from Yorkshire. He looked like what he was pretending to be, a young gentleman of some education and prospects, someone who belonged in these surroundings. The showroom manager noticed. There were opportunities, he said, for a bright young man who understood the business. Perhaps Haigh might try his hand at selling, might learn to close deals himself rather than simply fetching those who did. The salary would improve, the commissions could be substantial. All that was required was the right attitude, the willingness to be flexible in one's approach, to understand that business sometimes required creativity. What the manager meant, though he did not say it directly, was that the books were not entirely honest, that deals were sometimes structured in ways that benefited the salesman more than the customers, that a certain amount of deception was simply part of how things were done. Haigh understood immediately. He had been raised in an environment where every word and action was measured against an absolute standard of righteousness. But he had learned early that such standards were useful only for controlling others, not for governing oneself. He became a salesman. He was good at it. He had the right voice, educated but not pretentious, friendly but not familiar. He had the right manner, attentive without being servile, confident without being arrogant. He learned to gauge a customer in the first 30 seconds, to understand whether they needed to be flattered or impressed, or simply reassured that they were making a sound decision. He learned to lie without hesitation, to invent previous owners of impeccable reputation, to describe mechanical features that did not exist, to promise maintenance records that had never been kept. The money began to come in, not quickly, but steadily. He moved from the Earl's Court boarding house to a better set of rooms in South Kensington. He bought suits that had not previously belonged to other men. He ate in restaurants rather than boarding house dining rooms. He discovered that London had pleasures for those who could afford them, theatres, nightclubs and hotels where one could take tea in surroundings that spoke of money and breeding and the kind of life he had only glimpsed from a distance in Yorkshire. But selling cars was a limited opportunity. The Depression had gutted the market for luxury goods. The showroom saw days when no one entered, weeks when not a single sale was made. The manager began to cut commissions to hint that economies might be necessary, that staff might need to be reduced. Haigh saw what was coming and began to look for alternatives. He found them in the classified advertisements that ran in the back pages of the better newspapers. Businesses for sale, investment opportunities, partnerships sought. Most were legitimate, or at least legitimate enough, but some were not, and he had learned by now to recognize the language of fraud, the promises that were too good, the returns that were too generous, the ventures that required immediate cash investment with very little in return except trust. He studied these advertisements the way a scholar might study ancient texts, learning their grammar, their vocabulary, their underlying structure. And then he began to write his own, placing them in newspapers where men of property might see them, offering opportunities that existed only in his imagination. An engineering firm seeking capital for expansion, a motor company preparing to launch a revolutionary new design, a property development with guaranteed returns. The specifics varied, but the pattern was always the same. Impressive letterhead, a plausible story, an address that suggested substance, and a request for investment that was substantial but not so large as to trigger excessive caution. It worked. Men sent money. They sent it because the letters were beautifully written, because the documentation looked official, because Haigh presented himself as exactly the kind of serious young businessman who would never be involved in anything questionable. He opened bank accounts under false names. He rented office space for a day to meet investors who wanted to see the premises. He forged signatures on legal documents with the same care he had once used to polish automobiles. The money came in and the money went out again, spent on maintaining the appearance that generated more money. Better clothes, better rooms, meals in better restaurants where he might be seen by people who mattered. He joined a club, a modest establishment for professional men, where he played billiards and discussed the state of the economy with accountants and solicitors who had no idea that the well-spoken young man with the firm handshake was systematically defrauding people across London. It lasted 2 years. That was longer than most such schemes survived. But eventually someone became suspicious enough to consult a solicitor, and the solicitor consulted the police, and the police began to make inquiries. When they came to arrest him in 1934, he was living in a flat in Kensington that cost more in a month than his parents in Yorkshire earned in 3. He had 3 suits, a dozen shirts, shoes from a bootmaker in Jermyn Street, and no way to explain where the money had come from. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. He had forged documents, invented companies, stolen money from men who had trusted him based on nothing more than his appearance and his manner. The prosecutor described him as a confidence trickster of the worst sort, one who preyed on the trusting and the greedy alike, who had no honest occupation and no intention of pursuing one. The defence argued that he was young, that he had made mistakes, that he deserved a chance to reform. The judge sentenced him to 15 months in Wandsworth Prison. Wandsworth stood in southwest London, a Victorian fortress of dark brick and barred windows where Her Majesty's government kept those who had violated the social contract. Haigh entered its gates in November 1934, still wearing the good suit he had purchased with stolen money, and emerged in February 1936 wearing clothes the prison had issued, cheap serge that hung badly and smelled of disinfectant. Prison should have been a revelation, a punishment severe enough to redirect a young man's path. Instead, it became a postgraduate education in criminal methodology. Wandsworth housed thieves and forgers and violent men who had learned every trick of survival in a world that operated by different rules than the one outside. Haigh listened and learned. He learned which crimes paid and which did not, which methods drew police attention, and which could be practiced for years without consequence. He learned that the key to success was not avoiding crime, but avoiding detection. That evidence was everything, and without it, even the most obvious guilt could not be proven. He served his sentence without complaint, working in the prison workshop, eating the prison food, sleeping in the cell they assigned him. He was a model prisoner, quiet and obedient, causing no trouble, expressing appropriate contrition when parole was discussed. The prison chaplain spoke well of him. The warders noted his good behaviour. When he was released in February 1936, he walked out into a grey London morning with 7 shillings in his pocket and a head full of new ideas. He went back to what he knew: the fraud, the forgery, the careful construction of plausible lies. He was more careful now, more aware of the patterns that drew attention, but the essential method remained unchanged. Invent a business, create documentation, find investors, take their money, disappear before questions became too insistent. It worked again for a while, but in 1937 he was caught again, this time for forging a legal document in a property transaction. Another trial, another conviction, another prison sentence. This time they sent him to Lincoln Prison for 4 years. He was 28 years old, and he had spent more time in prison than in honest employment. Lincoln was harder than Wandsworth. The regime was stricter, the work more demanding, the other prisoners more dangerous. He kept to himself, avoided entanglements, and used the time to think. 4 years was long enough to understand that the pattern he had fallen into would eventually destroy him, that prison sentences grew longer with each conviction, that there were limits to how many times a man could be forgiven for the same offences. When the war came in 1939, he was still inside. He heard about it from the warders, from the newspapers that circulated through the prison, from the changes in routine as resources were diverted to the national effort. Men were needed. The country was fighting for survival. Even criminals might be useful if they were willing to serve. But Haigh remained where he was, working in the prison carpentry shop, watching the years pass, waiting for his release. It came in 1940, in the middle of the Blitz, when London was burning, and the world had changed in ways that made his previous crimes seem almost quaint. He stepped out into a city at war, where buildings collapsed in flames and bodies were pulled from rubble, and the old certainties are dissolved in smoke and blood. It was a new world, and John George Haigh, confidence man and forger, was ready to find his place in it. Chapter 3. The War's Long Shadow. London in 1940 bore no resemblance to the city Haigh had known before his imprisonment. The Blitz had begun in September, and every night the bombers came over in waves, dropping high explosives and incendiaries that turned entire neighbourhoods into firestorms. By day, work crews cleared rubble and extracted bodies. By night, people descended into tube stations and church crypts and reinforced basements, waiting for the all-clear that might not come, listening to the explosions that shook the earth above their heads. Into this chaos stepped a man who had just spent 4 years in prison, who had no legal means of support, who possessed nothing except the clothes the prison had issued and a release paper that marked him as a convicted criminal. But chaos created opportunities for those willing to exploit them, and Haigh had always been willing. He found lodging first, a room in Hammersmith in a house whose owner was too desperate for income to ask uncomfortable questions about a new tenant's background. Half the street had been destroyed by bombing. The house next door was a pile of bricks and shattered timber. But the landlady still collected rent every Friday, still insisted that her remaining tenants observe the blackout regulations, still served weak tea in cracked cups and pretended that the world had not fundamentally changed. Haigh needed work, but honest work was impossible. His prison record made that clear. No respectable employer would hire a man with 2 convictions for fraud and forgery, not when there were thousands of unemployed men with clean records desperate for any wage at all. The military would not take him either. Convicted criminals were not wanted, even in wartime, even when the need for men was desperate. So he returned to what he knew, but with modifications suited to the circumstances. Wartime London was full of people who had lost everything in the bombing, who needed help navigating insurance claims, who required assistance with government bureaucracy, who would pay for services that might or might not be legal, but were certainly necessary. He presented himself as a claims agent, someone who could expedite matters, who had connections, who could ensure that payments were made quickly and generously. Some of this was legitimate, some was fraud. The line between the two was often difficult to discern, and in wartime no one looked too closely as long as results were produced. He made enough to pay his rent and eat regularly and buy the occasional pint in a pub that might be reduced to rubble by morning. It was survival, nothing more, but survival was all that anyone could manage in those years. The Blitz ended in May 1941, and London breathed out and began the longer, slower work of enduring. The war continued, but differently now, without the nightly explosions, without the constant expectation of death falling from the sky. Life settled into a strange normality where everything was rationed, where queues formed for every commodity, where black market goods circulated among those who could afford them and knew where to look. Haigh found his way into these networks. He had a talent for meeting the right people, for being in the right place at the right time, for making himself useful to those who controlled access to scarce goods. He never became wealthy, but he accumulated enough money to move again, this time to better rooms in Kensington, to rebuild the wardrobe that 4 years in prison had cost him, to present himself once more as a gentleman of some standing. By 1943 he had established a pattern. He lived in respectable lodgings, frequented respectable establishments, cultivated relationships with people who had money and who trusted him because he looked and sounded like someone who belonged in their world. He had learned that appearance was everything, that a good suit and proper manners opened doors that remained closed to those who lacked them, that most people would rather trust a plausible lie than investigate an uncomfortable truth. He met William Donald McSwan in the summer of 1944. McSwan was 32 years old, the son of Donald and Amy McSwan, a couple who owned property in the cheaper parts of London and who had some money put away despite the war. Young Donald ran amusement arcades, the kind of marginal businesses that survived by serving working people who had a few coins to spend on pinball machines and one-armed bandits. He was not wealthy, but he was comfortable, and he had the kind of easy trust that comes from never having been seriously betrayed. They met by chance, or what appeared to be chance, in a public house near Leicester Square. Haigh had developed the skill of striking up conversations that seemed accidental, of finding common ground, of making himself seem like exactly the sort of person one might want as a friend. He told McSwan that he was in engineering, that he had connections in the motor trade, that there might be opportunities for profitable ventures once the war ended and normal commerce resumed. McSwan was interested. Everyone was interested in opportunities, in ways to position themselves with the post-war world that was surely coming, in schemes that might generate income beyond what rationing and regulation allowed. They met several more times over the following weeks, always in public houses or restaurants, always in circumstances that seemed casual and friendly. Haigh learned about McSwan's businesses, his family, his financial situation. He learned that Donald's parents owned properties worth thousands of pounds, that they trusted their son to manage certain affairs, that they were the kind of elderly couple who might be vulnerable to the right sort of approach. But McSwan himself was the immediate target. He was young, trusting, eager for whatever Haigh was suggesting, which was a partnership in acquiring properties that could be refurbished and sold at profit once the war ended. All it would require was some initial capital, some patience, some trust between partners who understood each other. McSwan had some money of his own, and access to more through his parents. He was willing to invest. He was willing to believe that John Haigh, well-dressed and well-spoken and apparently well-connected, was exactly who he claimed to be. They began to meet regularly. Haigh spun stories of properties he had identified, of deals that were almost ready to close, of opportunities that required just a bit more capital to bring to fruition. Some of this had a basis in reality. He did look at properties, did speak to estate agents, did create documentation that looked legitimate, but none of it was designed to generate profit for McSwan. It was all theatre, all preparation for something else entirely. In September 1944, Haigh invited McSwan to visit a small workshop he claimed to be renting in the basement of a building on Gloucester Road in South Kensington. He said he was using it for storage, for keeping building materials that were difficult to obtain through official channels, for conducting the kind of business that was easier done away from prying eyes. McSwan came willingly, excited to see evidence of the partnership's progress, trusting that his friend had his best interests at heart. The workshop was real enough. Haigh had rented it from a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent was paid. It occupied a basement space that had once been used for legitimate engineering work, that still contained some tools and equipment left behind by previous tenants. There was a bench, a sink, various odds and ends of metal and wood, and there was a 40-gallon drum, empty at the moment, standing in a corner. What happened in that basement on a September afternoon in 1944 marked a threshold that Haigh had been approaching for years without quite recognizing it. All his previous crimes had been bloodless, commercial, the kind of offences where no one was physically harmed even if they lost their money. He had been a thief, a fraud, but not a violent man. Not yet. But something had changed in him during those years in prison, during the war years when death fell randomly from the sky and people disappeared into rubble and no one asked too many questions about those who went missing. He had learned that the world was not governed by the moral certainties his mother had taught him in that Yorkshire chapel, that there was no divine accounting, no scales being balanced, no justice except what human institutions could impose. And he had learned that those institutions were fallible, that evidence was required for conviction, and that without evidence even murder might go unpunished. William Donald McSwan died in that basement workshop. The exact method is not recorded in the trial documents, but the result was certain. One moment there was a living man, trusting and hopeful, and the next moment there was a corpse. And Haigh, standing over what he had done, felt nothing except the cold calculation of what came next. He had prepared for this. That was the terrible thing, the thing that separated this from a crime of passion or a moment of madness. He had thought it through, had acquired what he would need, had chosen this location specifically because it was private and because it had the facilities required for what he intended. He was not acting on impulse. He was executing a plan. Chapter 4. The First Dissolution. The human body contains approximately 60% water. The bones are calcium and phosphate, minerals that give structure to soft tissue. The organs are protein and fat, complex arrangements of cells that cease their function the moment blood stops flowing. A human being is a chemical system, nothing more, and like any chemical system, it can be reduced to its constituent elements, given the right reagents and sufficient time. Sulfuric acid, when concentrated, is one of the most corrosive substances known to industrial chemistry. It strips electrons from other molecules, breaking chemical bonds, destroying the structural integrity of organic matter. In sufficient concentration and volume, it can reduce flesh and bone to a thick sludge of hydrolyzed proteins and dissolved minerals that bears no resemblance to what it once was. Haigh had learned this during his time working in engineering, during conversations with men who understood industrial processes, during his years of paying attention to information that might prove useful. He knew that concentrated sulfuric acid could be purchased legally for various industrial purposes. He knew that it could be transported and stored without particular difficulty as long as proper containers were used. He knew that it worked slowly, requiring hours or even days to complete its chemical transformation of organic material into liquid waste. And he knew that if a human body were placed in a drum filled with acid, and if that drum were left undisturbed for a sufficient period, what remained would be almost impossible to identify as having once been human. The basement workshop on Gloucester Road contained everything he needed. The drum was already there. Acquiring the acid was simply a matter of visiting a chemical supplier with a plausible story about needing it for metal treatment. The kind of transaction that happened every day in wartime London, where supplies were short and people made do with whatever they could obtain. He had purchased 40 gallons, enough to fill the drum nearly to the top. The body of William Donald McSwan went into the drum. The exact mechanics of this need not be detailed, but it required physical effort, the kind of work that left Haigh sweating and exhausted. The drum stood waist high. The body had to be manoeuvred into it, had to be positioned so that it would be completely submerged once the acid was added. It was ugly work, practical and horrible, the kind of thing that would haunt a normal person's dreams for years. But Haigh discovered that he was not troubled by it. He approached the task with the same methodical attention he had once brought to polishing automobiles or forging signatures. It was a problem to be solved, nothing more. The emotional content, the horror of what he was doing, seemed to exist somewhere outside his awareness, as if he were observing someone else's actions from a great distance. He poured the acid carefully, using a smaller container to transfer it from the carboys in which it had been delivered. The liquid was clear and colourless, almost like water except for its density and the faint, acrid smell that rose from its surface. It smoked slightly when it came into contact with organic matter, a reaction between the concentrated acid and the moisture in human tissue. The body began to dissolve immediately. The process was not rapid or dramatic. There was no explosion, no flame, no sudden transformation. Instead, there was a slow chemical reaction that proceeded at its own pace, breaking down cellular structures, dissolving proteins, leaching calcium from bone. The acid turned cloudy, then dark, as it filled with the products of hydrolysis. Haigh left the drum and went upstairs. He locked the basement door behind him and emerged into the London evening, into streets where people hurried home before blackout, where the ordinary business of life continued without pause. He took a bus back to his lodgings in Kensington. He washed his hands and face. He changed his clothes. He went out to a restaurant and ate a meal and conversed politely with the waiter about the weather and the progress of the war. That night he slept well, undisturbed by dreams or conscience. The next morning he returned to the basement to check on the acid's progress. The body was still visible beneath the cloudy surface, but it had begun to lose definition, to soften and collapse as the acid ate through tissue and bone. He left it again. Another day passed, and another. After 3 days, he returned to find that McSwan had been reduced to a thick sludge at the bottom of the drum, a viscous mixture of dissolved tissue and bone fragments suspended in acid that had turned black with organic matter. It no longer resembled anything human. It was just waste, chemical refuse, something that could be disposed of without fear of identification. He poured the contents of the drum down the drain in the basement, running water afterward to flush the pipes. What remained in the drum itself he scraped out and wrapped in newspaper and took to a bomb site a few streets away, where rubble and wreckage were piled high and no one would notice a few more pounds of unidentifiable material added to the mass. Within a week, even that would be covered over, buried beneath more debris, lost forever in the ruins that still littered London years after the worst of the bombing had ended. William Donald McSwan had vanished. His body no longer existed in any form that could be identified or recovered. There was no corpus delicti, no physical evidence that a crime had occurred. There was only absence, a space where a person had been, and John George Haigh, who knew exactly what had filled that space. Now came the second part of the plan. The part that required patience and acting ability, and the same confidence that had served him well in previous frauds. McSwan's parents needed to believe that their son was still alive, that he had gone away for some reason but remained in contact, that everything was normal even though they had not seen him in person. Haigh began to forge letters in McSwan's handwriting. He had examples of Donald's signature, samples of his writing from business documents they had exchanged. He practiced until he could reproduce the hand well enough to satisfy anyone who was not a professional examiner. The letters were brief, cheerful, full of vague explanations about business opportunities that required him to be elsewhere, promises that he would return soon, requests that his parents not worry. He posted these letters from different locations around London, timing them to arrive at intervals that seemed natural. And he visited the elder McSwans himself, presenting himself as their son's business partner, explaining that Donald was engaged in work that required discretion, assuring them that everything was proceeding well and that they should expect to hear from him regularly. Donald and Amy McSwan believed him because they had no reason not to. Their son had spoken well of this polite young man, had described him as a trustworthy associate, had given every indication that the partnership was legitimate, and the letters that arrived, written in Donald's own hand, confirmed what Haigh was telling them. Their son was alive, was well, was simply occupied with business that kept him away. Months passed. Haigh continued to send letters, continued to visit the elder McSwans, continued to maintain the fiction that everything was normal. He began to suggest that Donald had asked him to handle certain financial matters, to collect rents from properties, to manage business affairs while his partner was occupied elsewhere. The parents, trusting and elderly, allowed this. They signed documents that Haigh presented to them. They gave him access to accounts, to properties, to assets that had belonged to their son. The money began to flow into Hay's pockets. Not all at once, not so much that it would seem suspicious, but steadily, reliably, the kind of income that allowed him to maintain the appearance he had worked so hard to create. He moved to better lodgings, he bought better clothes, he ate in better restaurants. He began to live the life he had always believed he deserved. And in the basement on Gloucester Road, the drum sat empty and clean, waiting to be used again if circumstances required it. Because Haigh had discovered something important during those September days when he had dissolved his first victim. He had discovered that killing was not difficult, that disposing of a body was a solvable problem, that conscience was not the universal force he had been taught it was, that he could do this terrible thing and suffer no consequences except the ones imposed by external authorities, and those could be avoided as long as evidence was eliminated. He had crossed a threshold, and on the other side was a country where different rules applied, where human life had only the value he chose to give it, where murder was simply another tool in the kit of methods he used to extract money from the world. The acid had worked. The method had proven itself, and John George Haigh, who had once been a choir boy in a Yorkshire chapel, who had sung of grace and redemption and blood that washed sins white as snow, now understood that the only blood that mattered was the blood he had spilled, and that even that could be dissolved and flushed away as if it had never existed at all. Chapter 5. The Parents Who Came Looking. The fiction could not be maintained forever. Letters, no matter how carefully forged, could not substitute indefinitely for a son's presence. Donald and Amy McSwan were elderly but not senile, trusting but not foolish. By the summer of 1945, more than 9 months after their son had supposedly gone away on business, they were beginning to ask questions that Haigh found increasingly difficult to answer. The war in Europe had ended in May. The bells rang across London for the first time in years, ringing out victory and peace and the hope that life might return to something resembling normality. Soldiers were coming home, businesses were reopening. The rationing would continue for years yet, but the sense of emergency had lifted, and people were beginning to think about the future rather than simply surviving the present. In this atmosphere of return and reunion, the continued absence of William Donald McSwan became harder to explain. His parents wanted to see him. They wanted him to come home, or at least to visit, to explain in person what he was doing and why it required such prolonged absence. The letters that arrived in his handwriting were no longer sufficient. They wanted their son. Haigh visited them in their home in Clapham, a modest house on a street that had survived the bombing intact while neighbouring streets had been reduced to rubble. They received him in the front parlour, 2 people in their 60s, who had worked all their lives and who had accumulated a measure of comfort through rental properties and careful saving. Donald McSwan Sr. was a quiet man who had made his living in the building trade. Amy was sharper, more questioning, less willing to accept vague assurances. She asked when her son would return. She asked why he could not come for even a brief visit. She asked what kind of business required such secrecy, such distance from his family. Haigh answered with the same smooth confidence he had always shown, explaining that Donald was engaged in work that involved government contracts, that discretion was essential, that the war might be over but certain activities still required privacy. He produced another letter, supposedly written by Donald, that reinforced these explanations. But Amy McSwan was not satisfied. She said that she and her husband were considering travelling to Scotland, where the letter suggested Donald was working to see him themselves. They would go up on the train, would surprise him, would satisfy themselves that he was well and happy. Surely he would not object to a visit from his own parents. Haigh felt the careful structure he had built beginning to shift beneath him. If the McSwans went to Scotland, they would discover that their son was not there, had never been there, that the entire story was a fabrication. They would go to the police would investigate, and investigation, no matter how carefully he had covered his tracks, was dangerous. He needed to prevent them from going to Scotland. More than that, he needed to silence their questions permanently. The method that had worked with their son would work with them as well. The basement on Gloucester Road still held the drum. The acid could be purchased again. The process that had dissolved one body could dissolve 2. But 2 murders required more planning than 1. He could not simply invite them to the basement as he had invited their son. They were older, more cautious, less likely to visit a workshop in the evening on the pretext of seeing building materials. He needed a different approach, a different story, something that would bring them to the place he needed them to be without arousing suspicion. He told them that Donald had asked him to collect some items from the Gloucester Road property, family documents and valuables that needed to be stored safely, and that he would be happy to show them what he had retrieved if they would like to see it. Perhaps they might come with him to the basement, might verify that everything was being properly cared for, might even add items of their own that they wanted kept secure. It was plausible enough. The McSwans had trusted him for months, had signed over control of various properties and accounts, had no reason to suspect that their son's business partner wished them harm. They agreed to accompany him. On a July afternoon in 1945, with the sun bright in a sky that no longer feared bombers, Donald and Amy McSwan rode with John Haigh to Gloucester Road. The basement was dim even in daytime, lit only by whatever light filtered through the high windows that looked out at street level. Haigh unlocked the door and led them down the stairs, explaining that the documents were stored in the back, that it might take a moment to locate everything. They followed him into the space where their son had died 9 months earlier, where the drum that had dissolved his body still stood in its corner. What happened next happened quickly. Haigh had armed himself, had brought what was necessary to ensure that neither of them could cry out or escape. The exact details are not pleasant to contemplate, but the result was 2 bodies instead of 1. 2 elderly people who had trusted the wrong man, and who would never see the post-war world they had survived so much to reach. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening, preparing the drum, adding fresh acid, positioning the bodies. The process was familiar now, no longer shocking or strange. It was simply work, methodical and necessary. The clean-up after a problem had been solved. He had grown practiced at this, at the physical labour required, at the mental compartmentalisation that allowed him to do terrible things without emotional consequence. The acid began its work again. The same slow dissolution, the same chemical reduction of human tissue to anonymous sludge. He left the basement and locked it behind him, and emerged into the London evening where people were queuing for buses and hurrying home to their suppers and living their ordinary lives without the slightest suspicion that murder had just been committed a few feet beneath the pavement they walked on. Over the following days he returned periodically to check the progress, to ensure that the acid was doing what it was meant to do. The drum's contents grew darker, thicker, less recognisable. By the end of the week, Donald and Amy McSwan had ceased to exist in any physical form that could be identified or recovered. They had become waste, chemical byproduct, nothing more. Now came the even more complex task of explaining their absence. They had family beyond their son, friends, neighbours, people who would eventually ask questions about where they had gone. Haigh could not forge their signatures indefinitely. He could not maintain the fiction that they had simply moved away without anyone wondering why they had left so suddenly, why they had not said goodbye, why they had abandoned properties they had owned for years. He told people that the McSwans had decided to emigrate, that the war had exhausted them, that they wanted to make a fresh start somewhere new. He forged documents suggesting they had sold their properties to him, had transferred their accounts into his name, had asked him to manage the liquidation of their assets before they departed for Canada or Australia or some other distant place where fortunes could still be made. Some believed this readily. The post-war years saw thousands of Britons emigrating, seeking opportunities in the Dominions, leaving behind a country that was exhausted and broke and facing years of austerity. Others were more sceptical, asked more questions, required more elaborate explanations. But Haigh had become expert at lying, at maintaining multiple stories simultaneously, at remembering which version of events he had told to which person. And he had the advantage that no bodies had been found, that there was no physical evidence of crime, that the McSwans had simply vanished as people sometimes did in the chaos of post-war displacement. Missing persons were common. The police had more pressing concerns than elderly couples who seemed to have chosen to leave London. As long as no one reported suspicious circumstances, as long as no corpus delicti was discovered, investigation remained unlikely. The money from the McSwan properties began to flow more freely now. Haigh sold rental buildings, liquidated accounts, converted assets to cash that he could spend without restriction. He moved to more expensive lodgings, this time to the Onslow Court Hotel in South Kensington, a respectable establishment where professional people stayed for extended periods. The hotel provided meals, maid service, a lobby where one could receive guests, an address that suggested stability and substance. He lived well. He ate in good restaurants, wore suits from proper tailors, joined clubs where he could network with businessmen and solicitors, and the kind of people who had money to invest. He presented himself as a successful engineer and investor, someone who had profited from wartime opportunities and was now positioned to do even better in peacetime. People believed him because he looked and sounded the part, because he had the money to support the image, because nothing in his manner suggested that he had killed 3 people and dissolved their bodies in acid. But the money from the McSwans, substantial as it was, would not last forever. Haigh lived expensively. He gambled, sometimes heavily, at cards and at the dog races. He speculated on business ventures that sometimes succeeded but more often failed. By 1947, 2 years after the murder of Donald and Amy McSwan, he was beginning to run short again, beginning to consider whether the method that had worked 3 times might work again. He had proven something to himself through those killings. He had proven that murder was achievable, that bodies could be made to disappear, that the emotional barriers most people felt were simply conditioning that could be overcome through practice. He had killed 3 people and suffered no consequences except the practical ones of needing to maintain various deceptions. The guilt that should have crushed him, the horror that should have driven him mad, the conscience that his mother had tried so hard to instill, none of it existed. He felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of problems solved and money acquired. The basement on Gloucester Road was still available, but Haigh had begun to think about alternatives. London was becoming more crowded as soldiers returned and displaced persons sought housing. The city was rebuilding, and the number of empty basements and abandoned workshops was shrinking. He needed somewhere more private, more secure, somewhere he could work without fear of interruption or discovery. He began to look outside London, to the towns in the home counties, where small industrial units could be rented cheaply, where a man conducting legitimate business would draw no particular attention. He found what he needed in Crawley, a market town in Sussex about 30 miles south of London, a place small enough that strangers were noticed, but large enough that a single man renting a workshop would not seem unusual. The workshop stood on Leopold Road, part of a small industrial estate where various trades were practiced. It had been used for light engineering, for storage, for the kind of small-scale manufacturing that kept a few men employed and provided modest profit. The previous tenant had left some equipment behind, including drums and basic tools. The landlord asked few questions, accepted the rent Haigh offered, and handed over a key. Haigh moved his operation to Crawley in early 1948. He kept his rooms at the Onslow Court Hotel in London, maintaining the respectable facade, but he now had a private workspace where he could pursue activities that would not be interrupted or observed. The workshop became his laboratory, the place where he would refine his method and apply it to new victims who had the misfortune to trust him. The acid bath method had proven itself. The workshop was ready. And John George Haigh, now 38 years old, was prepared to kill again. Chapter 6. The Crawley Workshop. Leopold Road ran through an unremarkable part of Crawley, past small industrial buildings and workshops where honest tradesmen pursued legitimate business. The street saw little foot traffic beyond the men who worked there, who arrived in the morning and departed in the evening, who kept to themselves and asked no questions about what their neighbours were doing. It was the perfect location for someone who required privacy and anonymity. The workshop itself measured perhaps 30 feet by 20, a single room with a high ceiling and concrete floor, with windows set too high to allow casual observation from the street. The previous tenant had left behind a workbench, some shelving, and several 40-gallon drums of the type used for storing oils and chemicals. There was a sink in one corner, connected to the municipal water supply and drainage. There was electric lighting, dim but adequate. The space was cold in winter and close in summer, but it served its purpose. Haigh set about making the workshop functional for his needs. He purchased more drums, acquiring them from industrial suppliers who sold such items without question to anyone who claimed to need them for legitimate purposes. He bought concentrated sulfuric acid in large quantities, telling the suppliers he was doing metal treatment work, electroplating, the kind of industrial processes that genuinely required such chemicals. No one asked for documentation. In post-war England, the black market still flourished, and regulations were enforced loosely at best. He established a routine. Several times each week he would take the train from London to Crawley, arriving mid-morning, spending the day at the workshop doing nothing in particular, then returning to London in the evening. To anyone who noticed, he was simply another businessman managing a small operation, the kind of marginal enterprise that characterised much of British commerce in those years. But the workshop was not generating any product. It was not manufacturing anything, not storing anything of value, not serving any purpose that would be recognised as legitimate. It existed only as a place where Haigh could work without observation, where he could pursue the activities that had become his primary source of income. Murder and disposal, the reduction of human beings to chemical waste, the theft of their property and assets. He needed new victims. The money from the McSwans was running low, depleted by his expensive habits and poor investments. He began to look for prospects among the guests at the Onslow Court Hotel, among the people he met at the clubs he frequented, among those who had money, and who might be vulnerable to his particular skills of persuasion. In February 1948 he met Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie. They were staying at the Onslow Court Hotel while looking for a permanent home in London. Henderson was a doctor, recently returned from military service. With savings he wished to invest in property or business ventures. He was intelligent, educated, careful with money, exactly the sort of person who should have been difficult to deceive. But Haigh had refined his approach over years of practice. He no longer rushed things, no longer pushed too hard. He befriended the Hendersons gradually, established himself as a fellow guest. Someone cultured and interesting, someone who understood business and investment. He told them he was an engineer and inventor, that he held patents on various devices, that he operated a small manufacturing concern in Crawley, where he was developing new products. The Hendersons were interested. Dr. Henderson particularly was drawn to the idea of investing in innovation, in being part of the post-war industrial revival that everyone believed was coming. Haigh showed him documents, patents that were genuine enough, though they were related to inventions that had never been successfully commercialized, financial projections that looked impressive on paper. Over several weeks, trust was established. The Hendersons came to regard Haigh as a friend, someone whose company they enjoyed, whose business acumen they respected. When he invited them to visit his workshop in Crawley, to see the operation firsthand, to discuss potential investment opportunities, they accepted without hesitation. On February 12, 1948, Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie drove with John Haigh to Crawley in Henderson's own car. It was a cold day, overcast, the kind of grey February afternoon that made indoor spaces seem welcoming. They arrived at Leopold Road around midday. Haigh unlocked the workshop and led them inside. The space was arranged to suggest legitimate activity. The workbench held tools, the shelves contained materials. Nothing obviously sinister was visible. The drums stood against the walls, appearing to contain nothing more than industrial supplies. Haigh explained his supposed inventions, showed them blueprints and prototypes, spoke with enthusiasm about the commercial potential. The Hendersons listened, asked questions, examined what he showed them. They had brought a measure of money with them, prepared to make an initial investment if what they saw seemed promising. They were excited by the possibilities, by the idea that they might become part of something successful. And then, when their attention was focused elsewhere, when they were separated from each other by a few feet, when the moment was right, Haigh struck. He had prepared for this, had brought what was necessary, had planned the sequence of actions required. Two people were harder to manage than one, but not impossible for someone who had done this before, who understood the importance of speed and surprise. Dr. Archibald Henderson died first, then his wife Rosalie. The workshop filled with the silence that follows violence, the particular stillness of a space where life has just ended. And Haigh stood among what he had done, breathing hard from exertion, calculating what came next. 2 bodies, 2 drums, sufficient acid for both. He had refined his method since the McSwan murders. He understood now the optimal concentration of acid, the best way to position bodies for complete dissolution, the length of time required. The process had become almost routine, a series of steps to be followed methodically. He worked through the afternoon, preparing the drums, adding the acid, arranging everything so that the chemical reduction would proceed efficiently. By evening, when he locked the workshop and drove Henderson's car back to London, the acid was already beginning its work, already dissolving flesh and bone, already converting two human beings into anonymous sludge. The car was a problem. A Morris saloon, relatively new, registered to Dr. Henderson. It could not simply be abandoned without raising questions. Haigh drove it to a garage where he was known, told the mechanic that a friend had asked him to sell it, provided forged documentation suggesting Henderson had transferred ownership. The mechanic, accustomed to irregular transactions in the post-war market, asked no questions. The car was sold, the money deposited in Haigh's account. Over the following days, he returned to Crawley to monitor the acid's progress. The dissolution proceeded as expected. Within a week, nothing remained of Dr. and Mrs. Henderson, except the thick residue at the bottom of the drums, viscous and dark and completely unidentifiable. He poured this down the drain in the workshop, flushed it away with water, and cleaned the drums thoroughly. Now came the task of explaining the Hendersons' disappearance. They had friends, family, professional connections. People would wonder where they had gone, why they had not been in touch. Haigh could not maintain the fiction that they had emigrated, as he had with the McSwans. The Hendersons were younger, more connected, more likely to be missed. Instead, he told people that they had decided to travel abroad, that Henderson had taken a position overseas, that they had left suddenly due to the urgency of the opportunity. He forged letters in Henderson's handwriting, sent them to relatives and friends, maintained the appearance that the couple was alive and well and simply occupied elsewhere. He sold their belongings, cashed in their savings, converted every asset he could access into money that he could spend. The profits from the Henderson murders were substantial, more than he had gained from the McSwans, enough to support his lifestyle for perhaps a year, longer if he was careful. But Haigh was never careful with money. It flowed through his fingers like water, spent on clothes and meals and gambling and the constant effort to maintain the appearance that justified people's trust in him. The workshop on Leopold Road became his regular retreat. He visited several times each week, sometimes staying overnight in a small room above the workspace, sometimes bringing guests to show them his supposed business operations. The landlord saw him as an ideal tenant, quiet and responsible, always paying rent on time, causing no trouble. The neighbouring businesses barely noticed him. He was simply another man trying to make a living in the difficult post-war years, but the drums were always there, ready to be used again when circumstances required. The acid could be purchased whenever needed. The method had proven itself 4 times now, and with each repetition Haigh had grown more confident, more certain that he had discovered a perfect crime, murder that left no evidence, killing that could not be proven in court because corpus delicti did not exist. He understood the law well enough to know that a conviction for murder required proof that a person was dead and that the accused had caused that death. Without a body, without physical evidence of death, the case became much more difficult to prove. Witnesses could testify about disappearances, but disappearance was not murder. People vanished for many reasons. The war had displaced millions. Post-war reconstruction had sent thousands abroad. Missing persons reports were filed every week, and most remained unsolved forever. Haigh believed he was safe. He had killed 4 people and had suffered no consequences. The police had not come knocking. No one suspected him. His victims had vanished completely, reduced to sludge and flushed into the sewers, leaving nothing behind except the property and money he had stolen from them. He continued his life in London, maintained his rooms at the Onslow Court Hotel, cultivated relationships with people who might become useful. He presented himself as a successful businessman, someone with investments and interests and connections. And people believed him because they wanted to believe, because the alternative was to accept that the pleasant gentleman who dressed so well and spoke so properly might be something far darker. The workshop waited. The drums stood empty. The acid could be purchased whenever needed. And John George Haigh, who had once been a choir boy singing of grace and redemption, had become something that his mother's religion had no name for, something that existed outside the categories of saved and damned, something that was simply and terribly human in its capacity for evil. Chapter 7. The Doctor and His Wife. The method had proven itself. 4 victims, 4 perfect disappearances, 4 conversions of human flesh into chemical waste that left no evidence behind. Haigh moved through 1948 with growing confidence. Spending the money he had stolen from the Hendersons, living well at the Onslow Court Hotel, maintaining the fiction that he was a successful engineer and investor. But money spent is money gone, and by the autumn of that year he was facing familiar pressures. The hotel bill needed paying. The gambling debts were accumulating. The lifestyle he had constructed required constant funding. He needed another victim, someone with assets he could liquidate, someone who would trust him enough to accompany him to the workshop in Crawley. The Onslow Court Hotel provided a steady stream of prospects. The hotel catered to professional people, to those with some money who needed temporary accommodation while looking for permanent homes or conducting business in London. Haigh watched them carefully, assessed their wealth, evaluated their vulnerability. He was looking for someone alone or nearly alone, someone whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed, someone who had liquid assets that could be converted quickly to cash. In the hotel lounge, in the dining room, in the corridors and common spaces, he cultivated friendships with those who seemed promising. He was charming, well-spoken, attentive without being intrusive. He told stories about his business interests, his travels, his connections. He presented himself as someone who understood the world of money and investment, someone who might be helpful to those seeking opportunities. Some of these relationships led nowhere. The people moved on, found homes, left London, passed out of his orbit before he could maneuver them into position. Others were too cautious, too suspicious, too well connected to be good targets. But Haigh was patient. He had time. The right person would come along eventually, someone who met all his criteria, someone who could be killed and robbed and dissolved without consequences. The workshop in Crawley remained ready. He visited it regularly, maintaining the fiction that he was conducting legitimate business there. The landlord had no complaints. The neighbouring businesses noticed nothing unusual. The drums stood waiting, cleaned and empty, positioned where they could be filled quickly when the need arose. Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie had died in February. By November their money was nearly exhausted. Haigh had spent it on clothes, on restaurant meals, on the dogs and the card games, on maintaining an appearance that had become essential to his self-image. He saw himself as a gentleman, someone who belonged in the better class of establishments, someone who dressed well and ate well and lived according to standards that separated him from common criminals. But the money kept disappearing, flowing away faster than he could replace it through legitimate means. He had some income from small-time fraud, from the kind of minor deceptions he had practiced for years, but it was not enough. Not nearly enough. He needed a major score, another victim with substantial assets, another dissolution in the workshop followed by the patient work of converting a dead person's property into cash. Yet finding the right victim took time. The winter of 1948 passed into 1949. The hotel continued to provide prospects, but none quite right. Too poor or too well connected or too suspicious. Haigh waited and watched and maintained his friendly facade while the money dwindled and the pressure built. The drums in Crawley waited with him, empty and patient, ready to receive whatever he brought them, ready to reduce flesh and bone to chemical sludge, ready to erase another human being from existence. The acid could be purchased whenever needed from industrial suppliers who asked no questions. The method was perfected, refined through 4 successful applications. All Haigh needed was the right person to walk into his carefully constructed trap. He had learned through experience what worked. The approach had to be gradual, building trust over weeks or months. The victim had to believe that Haigh was a friend, a business associate, someone whose advice could be trusted. The invitation to Crawley had to seem natural, motivated by legitimate business concerns rather than predatory intent, and the victim had to have accessible assets, money in banks or property that could be sold, valuables that could be converted to cash without excessive delay. These requirements narrowed the field considerably. Most people were not wealthy enough to be worth killing. Most were too well connected to disappear without immediate investigation. Most would never trust Haigh sufficiently to accompany him to an isolated workshop, but occasionally someone appeared who met all the criteria, and when they did, Haigh was ready to act. The hotel provided its services to the same guests week after week, month after month. Haigh knew the regular residents, knew their habits and their circumstances. He paid particular attention to those who seemed lonely, who dined alone, who spent their evenings in the lounge reading or writing letters. Loneliness meant fewer connections, fewer people who would notice absence, fewer obstacles to perfect disappearance. He refined his performance continuously. The clothes had to be exactly right, expensive enough to suggest success, but not so ostentatious as to seem nouveau riche. The conversation had to be cultured but not pretentious, ranging across topics that demonstrated education and sophistication. The manner had to convey trustworthiness, the sense that this was a man who kept his word, who honoured his obligations, who could be relied upon. And beneath it all, beneath the charming facade and the carefully chosen words, was the cold calculation of a predator evaluating prey. How much were they worth? How easily could they be isolated? How quickly could their assets be liquidated? How thoroughly could they be made to disappear? The workshop had become central to his identity in ways he did not fully articulate even to himself. It was the place where he had proven something essential about himself, where he had demonstrated that he could kill without conscience, could dispose of bodies without leaving evidence, could commit murder and walk away unscathed. The basement on Gloucester Road had been the beginning, the first tentative experiment. But Crawley was different. Crawley was his space, arranged to his specifications, perfected through experience. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, indistinguishable from the other small industrial units that lined Leopold Road. But inside, behind the locked door, it had become a chamber where human life ended, and where the evidence of that ending was systematically erased. The drums, the acid, the sink where residue was washed away, the tools that made the work easier, everything arranged with the precision of someone who had learned through practice what was necessary. Haigh sometimes imagined what would happen if someone discovered the truth, if police searched the workshop and found what remained. But what would they find? Empty drums, cleaned thoroughly. Perhaps traces of acid, but acid was used for legitimate purposes in metal treatment and other industrial processes. Perhaps organic residue in the drains, but such residue could have many innocent explanations. Without bodies, without obvious bloodstains, without the unmistakable evidence of violence, the workshop would seem to be exactly what he claimed it was, a small engineering operation struggling along in the difficult post-war economy. This certainty, this conviction that he had achieved something close to the perfect crime, fed his growing confidence. He had killed 4 people and had suffered no consequences. The police had not come, no investigations had been launched. His victims had simply vanished, as people sometimes did, and the world had moved on without them. The winter nights were long and cold. Haigh spent them in the hotel lounge, reading newspapers, playing cards with other guests, maintaining the social connections that were essential to his hunting. He watched for signs of wealth, for indications of loneliness. for the particular vulnerability that made someone a suitable target. And he thought about the next one, whoever that would be, planned how the approach would unfold, how trust would be established, how the invitation to Crawley would be extended and accepted. Imagine the drive down from London, the conversation in the car, the arrival at Leopold Road, the unlocking of the door, the moment of realization that came too late, the silence that followed. The drums waited in Crawley. The acid could be purchased. The method was perfected. John George Haigh, who had dissolved 4 human beings into chemical sludge, was ready to kill again. All he needed was the right person to trust him, the right person to follow him into the workshop where flesh became nothing and life ended without leaving evidence behind. The next victim was closer than he knew, living in the same hotel, eating meals in the same dining room, passing him in the corridors every day. But he had not yet identified her, had not yet recognized that she met all his criteria. When he did, when the recognition came, events would unfold with the terrible inevitability of a mechanism that had been wound tight and was waiting only for release. The workshop waited. The drums stood empty. And somewhere in London, a woman who had no idea she was being hunted continued her ordinary life, unaware that she would soon become the next name in a catalogue of dissolution, the next body converted to sludge and flushed away as if it had never existed. Chapter 8. The Widow at the Onslow Court, Olive Henrietta Robarts. Joanne Deacon had lived 69 years by February 1949. She was a widow, her husband having died some years previous, leaving her with a comfortable income from investments and property. She resided at the Onslow Court Hotel not from necessity but from preference, finding the arrangement more convenient than maintaining a house on her own. The hotel provided meals, company, maid service, all the small comforts that made life easier for a woman of her age and circumstances. She was not a recluse. She took an active interest in the world, read the newspapers, attended church regularly, maintained friendships with other hotel residents. She had her own money, managed her own affairs, made her own decisions. She was intelligent, independent, accustomed to London society, exactly the sort of person who should have been difficult to deceive. But she had one characteristic that made her vulnerable to someone like John Haigh. She was interested in business opportunities, in schemes that might generate additional income or provide occupation for her time. She'd spoken several times about an idea she'd developed, a design for artificial fingernails that could be manufactured from a new type of plastic material. She believed there was a market for such items among women who wanted fashionable nails without the trouble of growing their own. All she needed was someone who understood manufacturing, who could help her develop the product and bring it to market. Haigh had listened to these conversations with the attention he always gave to potential opportunities. Mrs. Joanne Deacon was wealthy. She lived alone. She had few close relatives. Her assets were liquid, easily converted to cash. And she was speaking openly about wanting to invest in a manufacturing venture, providing him with the perfect pretext for drawing her into his web. He began to cultivate her friendship more deliberately in January 1949. Nothing obvious, nothing that would seem calculated. Simply more attention paid to her ideas, more interest shown in her artificial fingernail scheme, more suggestions that perhaps something could be done about it. He mentioned his workshop in Crawley, his experience with plastics and manufacturing, his connections with suppliers who could provide the materials needed. Mrs. Joanne Deacon responded enthusiastically. Here was someone who took her idea seriously, who believed it might actually work, who had the technical knowledge to make it reality. She began to discuss the project in more detail, sketching designs on hotel notepaper, describing the kind of fingernails she imagined, explaining how they might be marketed to department stores and beauty salons. Haigh encouraged all of this. He asked questions that demonstrated interest and expertise. He made suggestions that seemed helpful. He created the impression that he was genuinely excited about the commercial potential. that he saw in her idea something worth pursuing. And gradually, over several weeks, he steered the conversation toward the practical next steps. Perhaps she might visit the workshop, see the facilities, discuss what equipment would be needed to produce prototypes. Mrs. Durand Deacon was eager to proceed. She had money to invest, time to spare, and the conviction that her artificial fingernail idea represented a genuine business opportunity. When Haigh suggested they drive down to Crawley together to examine the workshop and discuss the project in detail, she accepted immediately. They arranged to go on Friday, February 18th, 1949. Haigh would collect her from the hotel after lunch. They would drive to Crawley, spend the afternoon discussing manufacturing possibilities, and return to London in the evening. It seemed perfectly reasonable, a business meeting between associates, nothing unusual or concerning. On the morning of February 18th, Mrs. Durand Deacon went about her normal routine. She had breakfast in the hotel dining room. She attended to some correspondence. She mentioned to another hotel resident, a Mrs. Lane, that she would be going to Crawley that afternoon with Mr. Haigh to look at his factory. Mrs. Lane, who knew both of them from the hotel, thought nothing of it. Mr. Haigh was a gentleman, someone trustworthy, someone who had always been perfectly proper in his behaviour. Just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Haigh collected Mrs. Durand Deacon from the hotel lobby. He was driving a hired car, a comfortable vehicle appropriate for the journey. She wore her good coat and hat, carried her handbag with her identification and some money, looked every bit the respectable businesswoman off to examine a potential investment. They drove south through London and out into Surrey, making conversation about the fingernail project, about business prospects, about the state of post-war manufacturing. The drive took slightly over an hour. They arrived at Leopold Road in mid-afternoon, under grey February skies that threatened rain. Haigh parked the car outside the workshop and unlocked the door. He led Mrs. Durand Deacon inside, turning on the dim electric lights, showing her the space that he claimed was devoted to engineering and manufacturing. She looked around with interest, examining the workbench and tools, asking questions about production capacity and materials. She was focused on her fingernail idea, on the practical details of how such items might be manufactured, on what equipment would be needed. She noticed the drums against the wall but thought nothing of them. Industrial workshops had drums for storing materials. There was nothing unusual about their presence. Haigh let her talk for a few minutes, let her walk deeper into the workshop, let her attention become absorbed in imagining how the space might be used, and then, when her back was turned, when she was separated from the door and from any possibility of escape, he struck. The exact method is not necessary to detail. The result was another body, another victim of misplaced trust. Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon, 69 years old, who had survived a world war and the Blitz and who had believed that a pleasant gentleman from her hotel wished to help her realise a business dream, died in a workshop in Crawley on a February afternoon. She had time perhaps to realise what was happening, to understand that she'd been deceived, but not time enough to save herself. Haigh stood over what he had done with the same cold detachment he had shown with previous victims. This was the fifth. The method was routine now, familiar in all its terrible details. He knew exactly what to do, exactly how long each step would take, exactly what result to expect. The emotional distance that had characterized his first killing had become complete absence of feeling. There was no guilt, no horror, no recognition that he had just ended a human life. There was only the practical problem of disposal and the anticipated reward of accessing Mrs. Durand Deacon's assets. He worked through the late afternoon and into the evening, preparing the drum, adding fresh acid purchased earlier that week in anticipation of this moment. The process had become almost mechanical, a series of steps executed with the precision of long practice. Position the body, add the acid, ensure complete submersion, leave it to work. By the time he finished the preliminary work and locked the workshop, it was dark. He drove Mrs. Durand Deacon's coat and handbag and jewellery to a different location, disposed of what could not be sold, kept what had value. Then he drove back to London, returned the hired car, and walked into the Onslow Court Hotel as if nothing had happened. In the hotel lounge, he encountered Mrs. Lane, the woman to whom Mrs. Durand Deacon had mentioned the Crawley trip. Mrs. Lane asked if he had seen Mrs. Durand Deacon, said that she had not returned and was not in her room. Haigh expressed mild surprise, said that Mrs. Durand Deacon had not kept their appointment, that he had waited at the hotel but she had never appeared. Perhaps she had changed her plans, gone somewhere else. These things happened. Mrs. Lane accepted this explanation initially, but as the evening progressed and Mrs. Durand Deacon still did not appear, as her room remained empty and her absence became more pronounced, concern began to grow. By the following morning, when she had still not returned, Mrs. Lane spoke to the hotel management, and the hotel management, after attempting unsuccessfully to locate their missing guest, contacted the police. The investigation began routinely. Missing person reports were common. Elderly people sometimes wandered off, sometimes fell ill in unexpected places, sometimes met with accidents. The police took statements from hotel staff and residents, established when Mrs. Durand Deacon had last been seen, tried to determine where she might have gone. Mrs. Lane told them about the planned trip to Crawley with Mr. Haigh. The police interviewed Haigh, who repeated his story that Mrs. Durand Deacon had not kept their appointment, that he had waited but she had never appeared. He was cooperative, helpful, expressed concern for the missing woman. Nothing in his manner suggested deception or guilt, but one of the investigating officers was more thorough than Haigh anticipated. Detective Inspector Albert Webb of the Metropolitan Police had experience with fraud cases, with confidence men, with people who lied convincingly. Something about Haigh's story did not quite sit right. The details were too neat, the explanation too smooth. Webb decided to look more closely at this helpful gentleman who claimed to have been stood up by the missing woman. A check of criminal records revealed that John George Haigh had previous convictions for fraud and theft. He had served time in Wandsworth and Lincoln prisons. He was not the respectable engineer he presented himself to be. He was a convicted criminal with a history of deception. This information changed the nature of the investigation. Webb obtained a warrant to search the workshop in Crawley, the place where Haigh claimed he had been waiting for Mrs. Durand Deacon. On February 26th, 8 days after Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance, police officers entered the Leopold Road premises. What they found there would expose the scope of Haigh's crimes and reveal that concentrated sulfuric acid, despite its terrible efficiency in destroying human tissue, does not actually dissolve everything. Some things remain, some evidence survives, and sometimes the perfect crime proves less perfect than its perpetrator believed. Chapter 9. The Sludge That Remained. The workshop in Crawley appeared unremarkable at first inspection. A small industrial space, concrete floor, high windows, the ordinary clutter of a marginal business operation. The police officers who entered on February 26th found tools and equipment, drums and supplies, nothing that obviously suggested criminal activity. But Detective Inspector Webb had learned through long experience that the absence of obvious evidence was not the same as the absence of evidence. He ordered a thorough search, every surface examined, every container opened, every corner investigated. The drums drew particular attention. Several stood against the wall, heavy steel vessels of the type used for storing industrial chemicals. Webb had them opened one by one. Most were empty, or nearly so, but one contained a thick, dark sludge at the bottom, viscous and foul-smelling, unlike anything that would result from legitimate engineering work. Webb ordered it preserved for analysis. He also ordered the drainage examined, the pipes inspected, samples taken from anywhere that might retain traces of whatever had been poured away. The search expanded. The concrete floor was scraped, samples collected from areas that showed staining. The sink was dismantled, the trap beneath examined. The yard outside the workshop was searched, the ground probed for anything that might have been buried. And gradually, over hours of methodical investigation, evidence began to accumulate. In the sludge at the bottom of the drum, forensic examination would later find traces of human fat, proteins that could only have come from dissolved tissue. In the yard outside, investigators found fragments of bone that had not been completely dissolved, small pieces that had escaped the acid's attention, and then, in the debris scattered near the workshop, they found something more substantial. A set of dentures, upper and lower plates, false teeth of the type worn by elderly people, whose natural teeth had been lost to age or disease. The dentures were partially corroded by acid, but still intact enough to be identifiable. And Mrs. Durand Deacon's dentist, when contacted, confirmed that he had made those exact dentures for her, that the characteristics matched his records precisely, that there was no doubt they had belonged to the missing woman. Other items surfaced during the search: a handbag strap, damaged but recognisable, jewellery that matched descriptions of items Mrs. Durand Deacon had owned, a lipstick case, small personal effects that had survived because Haigh had disposed of them separately rather than subjecting them to the acid bath. Each piece of evidence narrowed the circle, made the conclusion more inescapable. Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered in this workshop, her body dissolved in acid, the remains poured away as waste. And the man responsible was John George Haigh, who had presented himself as her friend and business associate, who had lured her to this isolated place with promises of helping her realise her commercial ambitions. The investigation expanded rapidly. If Haigh had killed Mrs. Durand Deacon, had he killed others? The police began to trace his movements over previous years, to investigate the people who had disappeared from his orbit, to examine financial transactions that might reveal stolen assets. The McSwans came to light first. Donald McSwan, reported missing in 1944, supposedly in Scotland on business. His parents Donald and Amy supposedly emigrated to Canada or Australia in 1945, but there were no records of emigration, no ship manifests, no immigration documents. The McSwans had simply vanished, and John Haigh had subsequently sold their properties and spent their money. Then the Hendersons, Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie, last seen in February 1948, supposedly travelling abroad. But again, no records of departure, no evidence they had ever left England. And again, Haigh had gained control of their assets, had sold their car, had liquidated their accounts. 5 people disappeared. 5 people whose last known contact had been with John Haigh. 5 people whose property and money had ended up in his possession. The pattern was unmistakable. Haigh was arrested on March 2nd, 1949, 12 days after Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance. The police had enough evidence to charge him with her murder. The dentures alone would be sufficient, combined with the organic residue in the workshop and his documented lies about their supposed appointment. But the investigators wanted more. They wanted a confession, wanted the full story, wanted to understand the scope of what had been done. Haigh surprised them by being willing to talk. Perhaps he believed that without complete bodies, conviction would be impossible. Perhaps he had reached a point where the burden of secrecy outweighed the protection it provided. Or perhaps, after years of maintaining elaborate deceptions, he simply wanted someone to know what he had accomplished, to understand the magnitude of his crimes. He confessed to all 5 murders, described the method in detail, the use of sulfuric acid to dissolve the bodies, the disposal of residue down drains or into rubble. He explained his reasoning, the financial motives, the careful planning that had gone into each killing. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as if discussing ordinary business transactions rather than acts of horrific violence. The confession included details that only the killer could know. The location of the Gloucester Road basement where the first 3 victims had been dissolved. The exact process used in Crawley for the Henderson and Durand Deacon murders. The disposal of clothing and personal effects. the forgery of documents to explain the victims' absences, the systematic theft of their assets. He seemed almost proud of what he had done, of the cleverness of his method, of the fact that he had killed 5 people and had nearly gotten away with it completely. The acid bath murders, as they were already being called in the newspapers, represented a kind of criminal perfection in his mind, a demonstration that with sufficient intelligence and planning, even murder could be made to leave no trace. But he had been wrong about that. Sulfuric acid, concentrated and given time, can indeed dissolve human flesh and bone. It can reduce a body to sludge, can break down organic compounds into unrecognizable chemical residue, but it does not destroy everything. Gallstones sometimes survive, their mineral composition resistant to acid. Bone fragments, if protected by position or surrounding tissue, may escape complete dissolution. And artificial objects, dentures and jewellery and plastic handbag components, remain stubbornly intact. The evidence assembled by the police filled boxes and occupied laboratory benches, the dentures, the bone fragments, the sludge from the drum, analysed chemically and found to contain human fat, the financial records showing Hay's systematic theft from his victims, the forged documents, the testimony of witnesses who had seen the victims in Hay's company before they disappeared. And there was the workshop itself, examined so thoroughly that every stain on the concrete floor was analysed, every residue in the drains was catalogued, every tool was tested for traces of blood or tissue. The space that Haigh had believed was perfect for disposal, where evidence would be eliminated completely, had instead preserved enough fragments and traces to reconstruct what had happened there. The case was solid. The prosecution would have no difficulty proving that Mrs. Durand Deacon had been murdered, that Haigh had killed her, that he had done so for financial gain. The confession provided context and detail. The physical evidence provided proof. The financial records provided motive. Haigh was held in custody while the prosecution prepared its case. He seemed unconcerned, even cheerful at times, as if he believed some technicality might save him, as if the absence of complete bodies might create reasonable doubt. He spoke freely about his crimes to anyone who would listen, to police officers and psychiatrists, and eventually to journalists who were allowed limited access. The newspapers seized on the story with enthusiasm. The acid bath murderer became a sensation, filling front pages across Britain. The details were gruesome enough to satisfy the public appetite for horror, exotic enough to seem almost fictional. A man who dissolved his victims in acid, who lived among respectable people while committing terrible crimes, who had killed 5 times before being caught. It was the kind of case that sold newspapers by the thousands, that dominated conversation in pubs and parlours, that made people look at their neighbours with new suspicion. Public fascination focused particularly on the acid bath method. It seemed so cold, so calculated, so completely removed from the passionate violence of most murders. There was no heat of the moment here, no crime of passion, no loss of control. Just methodical dissolution, chemical reduction, the systematic elimination of evidence. It was murder as chemistry, killing as industrial process. The trial was set for July 1949 at the Sussex Assizes in Lewes. The prosecution would present overwhelming evidence of guilt. The defence would attempt to argue insanity, would claim that no sane man could have done what Haigh had done, that the very nature of the crimes proved mental defect. But the law required more than unusual cruelty to establish insanity. It required proof that the accused did not understand the nature of his actions or did not know they were wrong. And Haigh had clearly known both. He had planned carefully. He had taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection. He had constructed alibis and forged documents. He had stolen his victims' money and spent it on maintaining a normal life. Every action demonstrated that he understood what he was doing and knew it was criminal. The machinery of justice ground forward. Witnesses were interviewed, evidence was catalogued, legal arguments were prepared. And in a cell in Lewes Prison, John George Haigh waited for the trial that would determine whether he would live or hang for what he had done in those workshops where acid turned flesh to sludge and human beings became nothing more than chemical waste. Chapter 10. The Horsham Gallows. The trial of John George Haigh opened on Monday, July 18, 1949, at the Sussex Assizes in Lewes. The courthouse filled early that morning with spectators who had queued for hours to secure seats, with journalists from every major newspaper, with curiosity seekers drawn by the sensational nature of the crimes. Outside, crowds gathered in the street, hoping for glimpses of the accused, talking in low voices about acid baths and dissolved bodies and the peculiar horror of murder reduced to chemistry. Haigh entered the dock looking composed, almost serene. He wore a good suit, freshly pressed, his hair neatly combed, his manner suggesting a businessman attending an important but routine meeting, rather than a man on trial for his life. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They called witnesses who had known the victims, who testified that they had last been seen in Haigh's company before vanishing forever. They presented financial evidence showing how Haigh had stolen and spent his victims' money. They brought forward the physical evidence from the Crawley workshop, the dentures that had belonged to Mrs. Durand Deacon, the bone fragments, the sludge containing human fat. The medical evidence was particularly damning. Forensic pathologists described how human bodies could be dissolved in sulfuric acid, explained the chemical processes involved, confirmed that the residue found in the workshop was consistent with such dissolution. The dentures were shown to the jury, identified definitively as having been made for Mrs. Durand Deacon. There was no possibility of mistake, no room for doubt. Haigh's own confession was read into the record. He had admitted killing 5 people, had described the methods in detail, had shown no remorse or regret. He had explained that he had killed for money, that he had chosen victims who could be made to disappear without investigation, that he had developed his acid bath method specifically to eliminate evidence of murder. The defence attempted to argue insanity, bringing forward psychiatrists who testified that Haigh claimed to drink his victims' blood before dissolving them, that he spoke of dreams involving forests of crucifixes dripping blood into containers he collected, that no sane person could have committed such acts. The defence painted him as a delusional madman, someone whose childhood in a strict religious household had damaged his mind beyond repair. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They pointed out that Haigh had functioned perfectly well in society for years, had maintained employment, had conducted complex frauds requiring intelligence and planning. They noted that his supposed vampirism had never been mentioned until after his arrest, that it appeared conveniently only when insanity became his only possible defence. They argued that the crimes themselves demonstrated sanity, that the careful planning and systematic concealment proved he understood what he was doing and knew it was wrong. The trial lasted only 2 days. The jury retired to consider their verdict on the afternoon of July 19th. They returned in less than 15 minutes with a verdict of guilty of murder. The judge, Sir Travers Humphreys, donned the black cap and pronounced sentence of death by hanging. Haigh showed no visible reaction. He bowed slightly to the judge, thanked the court for what he called a fair trial, and was led away to the cells beneath the courthouse. An appeal was filed immediately, as was customary in capital cases, but no one expected it to succeed. The evidence was too strong, the verdict too clearly supported by facts. The appeal was heard and dismissed. The Home Secretary reviewed the case and found no grounds for commutation of sentence. John George Haigh would hang for the murder of Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon, though everyone understood he was being executed for all 5 murders, for the systematic killing spree that had terrorised those who learned of it, and made people question how such evil could exist behind such an ordinary face. The execution was scheduled for Wednesday, August 10, 1949, at Wandsworth Prison in London. Haigh was transferred there from Lewes in early August. He spent his final days in the condemned cell, a space that was watched constantly by guards to prevent suicide, where every moment was observed and recorded. He received visits from his family, from his elderly parents who could not understand how the choir boy from Yorkshire had become the acid bath murderer. His mother came, her face drawn with grief and incomprehension, and spoke to him through bars about faith and forgiveness, and the salvation that awaited the truly repentant. He listened politely, said little, gave no indication whether he felt remorse or regret or anything at all. The prison chaplain visited daily, offering spiritual counsel, reading scripture, praying for the condemned man's soul. Haigh accepted these attentions with the same courtesy he had shown to everyone throughout his life, the same surface amiability that had allowed him to move undetected through respectable society while committing terrible crimes. On the evening of August 9th, he ate his final meal, slept reasonably well according to the watching guards, and woke on the morning of his execution calm and composed. He dressed carefully, attended to his appearance with the same attention to detail he had always shown. When asked if he had any final requests, he said only that he would like a cup of tea. The execution was set for 9 o'clock in the morning. At that hour, Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, entered the condemned cell with his assistant. Pierrepoint had hanged hundreds of people over his long career, had perfected the calculation of drop length based on weight and build, had reduced judicial killing to a science almost as precise as Haigh's own method of dissolution. Haigh walked to the scaffold without resistance. The gallows stood in a shed adjacent to the main prison building, a simple apparatus of beam and trapdoor and rope. He stepped onto the trap, stood while his legs were strapped and the white hood was placed over his head and the noose was positioned around his neck. The whole process took less than 30 seconds from the moment he entered the shed. Pierrepoint pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. John George Haigh dropped through it and died instantly as the rope broke his neck with the force of the calculated fall. The prison doctor examined him and pronounced him dead. The time was recorded as 9:03 in the morning, August 10th, 1949. Outside the prison, a small crowd had gathered, as crowds always gathered for executions, though they could see nothing of what happened within the walls. Some were opposed to capital punishment and carried signs protesting judicial killing. Others simply wanted to be present at this moment, to witness in some attenuated way the end of the man who had dissolved 5 people in acid. When the notice of execution was posted on the prison gate at 9:15, confirming that sentence had been carried out, some cheered and some stood silent and some turned away. The body remained hanging for the customary hour, then was taken down and buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, as was the practice with executed criminals. John George Haigh ceased to exist in any physical form, reduced finally to the same kind of absence he had inflicted on his victims. The newspapers devoted columns to his death, to speculation about what had made him what he was, to warnings about the dangers of trusting appearances, to debates about capital punishment and criminal psychology. The public remained fascinated for weeks. Then gradually other stories displaced the acid bath murderer from the headlines, and his name faded from immediate memory into history. The workshop in Crawley was dismantled, the drums removed, the space cleaned and eventually rented to another tenant who conducted legitimate business there and never knew what terrible things had happened in that ordinary room. The Onslow Court Hotel continued to operate, though some guests moved out after learning that a murderer had lived among them, eating at the same tables, walking the same corridors, appearing perfectly normal while planning dissolution and death. The families of the victims mourned as best they could, though mourning was complicated by the absence of bodies, by the knowledge that their loved ones had been reduced to sludge and flushed away like waste. There were no proper funerals, no graves to visit, only the terrible knowledge of what had been done and the small comfort that justice had been served even if it could not restore what had been taken. The case entered criminal history as one of the most methodical and chilling murder sprees Britain had ever seen. Law enforcement agencies studied it, learning from both the crimes and the investigation, understanding better how to search for evidence even when perpetrators believed they had eliminated it completely. The acid bath method became known worldwide, though few attempted to replicate it, perhaps deterred by Haigh's example of how even the most careful criminal could be undone by overlooked fragments and traces. In the end, John George Haigh's life described an arc from chapel to gallows, from a Yorkshire childhood governed by rigid faith to execution for crimes that demonstrated the complete absence of moral constraint. His mother had tried to build a wall around him to keep evil out, but the wall had instead kept goodness in a space he learned to step beyond whenever convenience suggested it. The choir boy who sang of grace became the man who dissolved flesh in acid. The child who was taught that sin required washing found a more literal kind of washing, one that eliminated evidence rather than guilt. The drum stood empty now. The acid had been disposed of as hazardous waste. The workshop was just a workshop again. And in the darkness of an unmarked grave, John George Haigh lay in the earth that he had once believed could be circumvented, as if death and judgment were simply problems that could be solved through chemistry and careful planning. But some things cannot be dissolved. Some things remain: memory, record, the names of the dead, and the final accounting that comes for everyone, regardless of how cleverly they believe they have escaped it. The candle burned low in rooms across England where people had read about the acid bath murderer, and wondered at the capacity for evil that could hide behind a pleasant smile and a well-pressed suit. The chamber of his life fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark, leaving behind another story of what human beings are capable of becoming when conscience dissolves more completely than flesh ever could.